In this video we're going to look at the Mongols and the Ottoman Empire. And we'll look at the shifts along the Silk Roads, the Eastern empires, their effects on Europe, and Europe's westward expansions. First, let's take a look at the Mongol civilization before Ghengis Khan. And the Mongols are the descendants of the Xiongnu, the Huns, and the other horse people of the steppe. So if you think in those terms, you already know a lot about Mongol life, even if you've never really heard of the Mongols before, right? They were nomads, and they followed the weather and the pasturage for their animals, right? The availability of water and green grass. And they were very tough warriors, as you know, all nomadic peoples are. I mean, you're talking about people who live basically in a saddle all day long and fight all day long, and just very tough people. And politically, they were loosely organized into tribes, and sometimes they joined into larger confederacies, and that's going to be the mark of Ghengis Khan, especially, as we're going to see. And, they also lived through raiding and banditry and theft, and Mongol culture early on was very, very violent, and rape was also a common practice of the Mongols. And so out of this tough, warlike, nomadic culture comes Ghengis Khan. And he was born in the 1170s. And his grandfather and father had been great leaders, but they'd fallen from power. Their father was poisoned. And so, in Ghengis Khan's youth, he was, kind of this, ragtag little boy who, lived with family, and, they were very poor. Not much influence or power within their community. And he was taken prisoner in 1182 by a rival tribe and kept in a wooden collar and enslaved and humiliated. And this really shaped him in his desire to rise to power and really never be treated like that again. And so once he was freed, he showed incredible brilliance as a warrior, and as an individual warrior and as a leader of men. And so he rose very quickly and was able to unite all of the Mongol tribes into a confederacy and become the Khagan, or the head Khan. In English we might use a term like emperor or king of kings, because that's what he was. And so in 1206 he was able to unite the people. And, we see this very often with nomadic peoples who fight among themselves very violently. Once they become united and turn on the outside world, they are a very dangerous and powerful group. And Ghengis Khan was an interesting figure. While he united a lot of the world, he was also incredibly violent and really feared. In fact, one quote that's often attributed to him, I don't know if he actually said this or not, people debate about this, but he once said that his greatest pleasure was making war and riding his enemies' horses and sleeping with their wives and daughters. I mean, this is the kind of man he was. This is the kind of men the Mongols were. And so as they expanded primarily southward into China and towards the southwest into what is now Afghanistan, northern Iran, kind of typical Mongol approach was to offer surrender to communities, walled cities especially. And if the people inside refused, he would kill everyone in the city or town. I mean, children, everyone. There was one exception, though. He would often spare people with literary or scientific or technical skills. He learned that scholars and engineers and people with technical know-how were simply too valuable to kill. And so he and his men would just interview the prisoners. What do you do for a living? I'm a farmer. Boom, they're dead. What do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a scribe. Hey, you're going to join us and work for us now. Traditionally, the Mongols were an illiterate people, but they recognized the value of things like reading and writing, and so they kept the scribes and used them. In fact, the Mongols learned how to make siege weapons from Chinese captives. Right, as horse people, the Mongols never would have even had a reason to build a catapult or a battering ram or something like that. And so, but by capturing Chinese engineers and putting them to work, the Mongols became very, very successful against walled cities. And as I said, they expanded downwards into northern Persia, what we would now call Iran, and they actually caused the collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate. So if you remember back to your lessons on Islamic history, these are the people that caused the downfall of the great Muslim Caliphate. And so eventually, under Genghis Khan's leadership, the Mongols were able to build up a very, very large empire. And as you can see from the map here, it stretched all the way from the Pacific to Europe. In the blue area there, which represents modern-day Ukraine and Western Russia, was not part of the Mongol Empire, but controlled by the Mongol Empire. Also, parts of the Middle East, extending into Mesopotamia, northern Arabia, all of Persia, right? And so eventually this empire became so large that it couldn't be controlled by just one man or one group of people, and so it divided into khanates, or kingdoms. And these were ruled primarily by Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons, and they really built a big, powerful empire. It was built with bloodshed, and it was built through violence. So I don't think we'd want to say that the Mongols were necessarily a good thing in history, but at the same time they built this big, peaceful empire that brought a lot of stability to the region. And it was, generally understood that as long as you didn't mess with the Khans, you could live a pretty peaceful, stable life. In fact, it was said of the empire during his grandson's time that a girl could walk the Silk Roads with a golden pitcher on her head and not be molested. And that's pretty remarkable when you figure that for most of the history of the Silk Roads, these were incredibly violent and dangerous and crime-ridden places, right? What better place to steal than the Silk Roads? Under Genghis Khan's grandson, the famous Kublai Khan, the Mongols even founded a Chinese dynasty, the so-called Yuan dynasty. So, a great successful empire that had massive influence on not only Europe, but India, the Islamic world, and China. In fact, if we look at a map of the empire here with the Silk Road over it, you can see just what kind of business and trade and resources these people controlled. And so let's take a look at the effects of the Mongol Empire on European history, right? And the Mongols, as I've said, controlled Russia. They also controlled eastern Poland and Hungary and Romania. And, they changed the nature of European warfare, right? When we think about European warfare in the Middle Ages, we think about castles and catapults, and those had been somewhat a part of European warfare. But the introduction of the Muslims and their catapults really changed castle architecture and changed the way Europeans fought. And as I said, by controlling the Silk Road trades, the Mongols had a massive influence on European economies, right? Nothing goes across the Silk Roads unless it goes through the Mongols, and so that changed the cost and availability of goods. Silks and porcelains and spices. The Mongols controlled all that trade, and so they were able to set prices and control who was able to buy those things. And that had a big influence on European history, as we're going to see. The Mongols were also thought to have transmitted the Black Death, right? This horrible plague that I'm going to talk about in the European history lecture. Probably came along the Silk Roads on Mongol horses, right? Black Plague is transmitted by fleas, and so these fleas would have been on the Mongol horses in the Mongol saddlebags. Eventually they reach Europe and have devastating consequences. However, as we're going to see in our DBQs, the Europeans really didn't know much about the Mongols. They knew they were there, they knew they were powerful, but the kinds of stories that Europeans would tell about Mongols were often bizarre and simply untrue. So let's shift our focus now to the Seljuk Turks and the origins of the Ottoman Empire. right? And so the Seljuks were another one of these North Central Asian tribes. As you can see, the orange circle on the map there, that's northern Iran, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, that area in there. And so they're another one of these horse people from the steppe. So you're probably starting to see a pattern in world history if you've been following the lessons, right? And originally the Seljuks worked for the Abbasids and, Persian rulers in the region. And eventually they were able to develop a kingdom of their own that stretched to the borders of the Byzantine Empire. And you recall, our lessons on the Byzantines from Project 3, if you watch them. Eventually, though, the Seljuk kingdom of Rum collapsed, and this caused disorder among the Seljuks. They were there in northern Mesopotamia and the Near East. And so, one of the splinter groups from the breakdown of the Seljuk kingdom were a group known as the Ottomans. And slowly they came together and gained territory throughout the crumbling Byzantine Empire, especially in modern-day Romania and southern Hungary, Serbia and Croatia. And, they slowly gained in power and became more organized, developed a stronger military, and they were able to become a big world empire when they captured Constantinople in 1453. And the fall of Constantinople is, one of the most important events in world history, as we're going to see in this project. Now, politically, the Ottomans were ruled by a sultan, who was a kind of emperor, not necessarily a religious leader, more of a political leader, although there was some religious influence there. But the sultans were different than the caliphs of earlier Islamic history. And then they were very strong in Egypt and southeastern Europe, northern Arabia, and Persia. And this was a big empire, throughout the Middle East. They were one of the first empires to use guns and cannons. Their janissaries, which were a class of soldiers, were among the most feared soldiers in the world at this time period. And they had a lot of problems with succession, in figuring out who the new sultan would be after the old sultan died. These sultans had massive harems and therefore had a lot of sons, and so the politics of who would become the next sultan often involved brothers killing brothers and concubines and wives scheming to, figure out whose son would ultimately become the sultan. It was a real problem for the Ottomans, but they were able to succeed for a long time. The Ottomans were a very rich, sophisticated civilization. I mean, they sat right there at the crossroads of Europe and the Silk Roads, and they had the legacy of Arabic math and science and the legacy of Roman engineering and architecture, and so the Ottomans were able to develop very, very sophisticated buildings. Calligraphy was also important to the Ottomans, as it is for most Muslim cultures, because depicting the human form can be seen as idolatry, and so often calligraphy was the main form of art. And they brought a lot of stability to the Middle East, and this probably wasn't what the Europeans wanted in that region, but for the people of the area, it was generally a fairly peaceful and organized time. And as I said, they were some of the early users of guns and cannons, and so had large influence on the warfare of Europe, northeastern Africa, and the Middle East, as far away as India. The Ottomans were known as one of the so-called gunpowder empires. And as you can imagine, the Ottomans had a big impact on European history as well. I mean, they ended the Roman Empire. We talk about the fall of the Roman Empire in the 400s, but really that was the fall of the Western Roman Empire. When Constantinople falls in 1453, that's it. There is no more Roman Empire for sure this time. And as they gained in power, the Ottomans, ran into conflicts with Spain. At the time, Spain was the major naval power in both the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. conflicts with Venice, right? If you studied Othello in Project 3, it's the Ottoman Turks who Othello is leading the Venetians against, especially in the eastern Mediterranean around Cyprus and the coasts of Lebanon and Palestine. And so, as you look at the map here, you can see that they had control over the access to the traditional trade routes. So, between the Mongols to the north and the Ottomans to the south, the Silk Roads are blocked off. And the Ottomans also threatened southeastern Europe. I mean, pushed as far as Vienna in the Austrian Empire, and until the fall of the Roman Empire, until the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1453, back that up. Until the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1914, conflicts between the Ottomans and the Europeans were pretty much constant. And so that's it. This lesson is done. So take this knowledge with you into the chain reactions DBQ. That'll be our first DBQ in this project. And, just really keep in mind how the geographic position of the Mongols and the Ottomans had a big impact on the Spanish and the Portuguese exploration into the Americas and Africa. I mean, that's what the chain reactions DBQ is all about. You get this push from the east of the Mongols and the Ottomans, and they're pushing westward, and so that pushes Europe westward. Well, what's westward? North America and South America.